Capcom's DLC for Resident Evil Village is only a couple of weeks away, and it includes a mouth-watering third-person mode which will not only appeal to fans of the original Resident Evil games, but will no doubt get players in the mood for the Resident Evil 4 remake due out next year. The DLC announcement came roughly 2 weeks since I first completed Resident Evil Village, and since completing it for the first time, I've played through it a further 4 more times. I have unlocked the Wolfsbane Magnum and Stake Magnum, both with unlimited ammo, and blasting your way through the game with these beasts, along with a fully maxed out semi-automatic shotgun with unlimited ammo, makes for a very fun experience. The last time I played a Resident Evil game where I would immediately start a new game straight after completion would be Resident Evil 4, and the similarities and vibes Resident Evil Village shares with Resident Evil 4 is uncanny. I didn't think I would enjoy Village as much as I did. If truth be told, it's the only main entry Resident Evil game that I've never pre-ordered. Not because I didn't enjoy the previous entry, Resident Evil 7, because I very much did, despite it being first person. But I found that Resident Evil as a brand doesn't have much in common with the original games that I fell in love with over 25 years ago. We're all too familiar with the route Capcom decided to take the franchise down since Resident Evil 4, with its over-the-top action replacing the slower, more atmospheric experience the original titles done so well. But with Resident Evil 7, Capcom decided to bring back the survival horror elements that made the originals so popular, albeit in first-person mode. Unfortunately, they didn't bring back anything else familiar for fans of the originals. The characters and story were so different to the older titles that Resident Evil 7 could have literally been a new survival horror franchise, as apart from a few Easter eggs here and there, it was unrecognisable as a Resident Evil game. The 7th and 8th Resident Evil games really could and should have been the beginnings of a new Capcom survival horror franchise, with the Resident Evil series being left alone only to be remade every so often. But the Resident Evil name sells, so I understand. So that's why I didn't get excited for Resident Evil 8. But what made me buy it, other than the fact it was discounted on the PSN store, is that it's the only main entry title I didn't own, and the fact I hadn't played it a year after its release was starting to niggle away at me. I watched the Happy Console Gamer do a video on the main entry Resident Evil titles where he put them in order of his most favourite, and it convinced me to give number 8 a go. Plus it meant I could make a similar video in the future. So I downloaded Resident Evil Village and spent a few days completing it, then completing it again and again and again. I will start off by saying that I really enjoyed it. I loved the decision to use a village as the main setting, as it allows for a bit of exploration. It's not the first time a Resident Evil game has taken place in a European village, of course, and as I said earlier, there was similarities to Resident Evil 4 throughout. But in terms of being relatable to the original Resident Evil games, it just wasn't there. In truth, the characters, dialogue and voice acting in Resident Evil 8 felt a little bit too theatrical, if that makes sense. Where Resident Evil 7 felt like a proper old school horror movie that was genuinely terrifying, Resident Evil 8 was a bit more Disney meets Tim Burton meets Wes Craven. Lady Dimitrescu, her daughters and the castle they occupy all looked and felt like something from a fairy tale story. I couldn't help but be reminded of Cruella de Vil from 101 Dalmatians every time Lady Dimitrescu appeared. But that's not to say she wasn't terrifying. Having this towering, big-breasted lady stalking you throughout her mansion was every bit as nerve-wracking as it was when Jack Baker was doing the same in Louisiana last time out. And just like 7, we play as Ethan Winters. I was surprised to see him take the lead in another Resident Evil game. Back in Resident Evil 7, he had as much personality as a trainee police officer. That might be a bit unfair though. I think playing a character in a first-person mode where you're not shown in any cutscenes makes it very difficult to give off any sort of likeable traits. Not being able to see your character's face and reactions means you're sacrificing a bit of character personality. He's no Leon Kennedy or Chris Redfield, but give him his dues because he goes through more than those two guys have in his only 2 appearances. If you play through Resident Evil 7 and 8 and fail to have a soft spot for this poor guy at the end, then you must have a heart made of stone. I mean, Chris and Leon never had their hand cut off by their wife or had to go searching for their missing daughter, who incidentally was kidnapped by Chris, who also killed his wife. Okay, I've changed my mind. I kinda like Ethan now, and Chris is a dick. But Resident Evil Village is about searching for Ethan's baby daughter Rose, who was, as I mentioned, kidnapped by Chris Redfield and his team for reasons not yet known. During the kidnapping of Rose, Ethan's wife Mia gets brutally gunned down while Ethan himself gets bundled into the same van as his daughter, and the game essentially starts when Ethan awakes from the inevitable car crash and finds himself alone in a creepy abandoned village. The village opens up the further you progress in the game, unveiling more areas and more treasures, and although it's played pretty much in daylight throughout, It had such an eerie feel the whole time. A brave move considering Resident Evil 5 was mainly set during the day and failed miserably in creating a scary game. But on 8 I constantly felt like I could get attacked at any moment. The tension in parts was just like the originals. I did realise one newish tradition that's been retained since Resident Evil 4, and that is near the start of many Resident Evil titles there tends to be a tradition of overwhelming the player with numerous enemies very early into the game. Resident Evil 4 done it when the villagers suddenly turn on Leon and chase him around the village. It happens in Resident Evil 5 with Chris and Shiva, and in Resident Evil 6 Leon's campaign sort of throws you into a run for your life situation near the start. Resident Evil 8 keeps up this newest tradition, it seems, by doing a Resident Evil 4 on poor Ethan Winters. You find yourself being overwhelmed by these man-like creatures called Lycans, and you literally have to run and gun as best you can till they decide to leave you alone. It's good preparation for what's to come. Although I prefer this part of the game with my unlimited shotgun as opposed to the first playthrough where I'm literally screaming at the TV while running in circles. After the rush of enemies, you'll meet with other survivors in a safe house before heading on the move alone and heading for Castle Dimitrescu. The castle is a throwback to the mansion-style buildings of the original Resi games, and it's a great setting that will see you wandering around carefully avoiding the roaming Lady Dimitrescu and her 3 daughters. This part of the game has a sort of Resident Evil 7 feel to it, as just like Jack Baker, the female protagonists here can and will pop out of nowhere. You're never really caught unawares, as there's a certain soundtrack that accompanies Lady Dimitrescu which acts as a warning and gives you a few seconds head start, but it's certainly unsettling enough. What the game does well here is it keeps you on the edge of your seat. I was constantly holding my breath every time I approached a door, ready to run the other way if she happened to open it as I was walking towards it. That was always the fear. It's fine when you spot her at the other end of a hall, but when you're approaching a door knowing she could just so happen pop through at the same time was tense to say the least. If you manage to survive Castle Dimitrescu and kill off the women trying to hunt you down, you'll find yourself back at the village where it all began. This time there are more areas of the village, all with a boss to defeat at the end. By defeating the area boss, you'll be rewarded with a liquefied body part of your daughter Rose. It sounds horrific, and in truth it is. I don't mind bad things happening to Mia or Ethan, but there's something uncomfortable when baby Rose is concerned. Got to respect Capcom for deciding that not even babies are safe in the Resident Evil universe. Now, among the new areas needed to complete will be House Benevito, which is a haunted mansion that slows the pace of the game right down. No weapons needed here, as it's a case of solving puzzles and getting the hell out of there. Survive that and you'll soon be heading to a swamp with possibly the ugliest boss in the Resident Evil history. After that you'll head to the stronghold of Lycans. There are so many enemies here. Nothing eerie or slow paced about this part of the game. It is balls to the wall action throughout. Once you've defeated all the areas and their bosses, you'll put your liquefied body parts of Baby Rose in a ritualistic looking device that uncovers the path to the final stage of the game, the factory. A factory which I found pretty confusing at times and led to me going around in circles if I'm honest, but that says more about me and my general sense of direction. The factory isn't the final showdown, as you'll get to play as Chris Redfield near the end. This is another balls to the wall shoot 'em up, and I felt it was pretty unnecessary if I'm honest. I didn't see how it added to the story. I think it might have been an attempt to please fans of the original Resident Evil games by putting you in control of Chris and giving him machine guns and plenty of ammo. After your little shot of Chris, you're back in control of Ethan for the final showdown. I'm not going to talk about the ending, but it does wrap things up for Ethan and also leaves a little bit there for the next Resident Evil title, if it decides to go in that direction. If you completed it, then you know what I mean. Overall, this is a fantastic game. It has more action than Resident Evil 7, but it manages to retain that similar nail-biting horror experience. Fans of the original 4 will love it, but fans of the originals may not. In terms of gameplay, I'd say it's pretty balanced between action and horror. Yes, it gets a bit trigger happy towards the middle and end of the game, with no real need to conserve ammo as enemies regularly drop them, and the shopkeeper Duke makes himself available for business in most areas of the game. These last 2 points are very much influenced by Resident Evil 4, and the shopkeeper Duke is just as odd as 4's merchant. He offers weapons, upgrades, supplies, and even meals that he'll cook for you if you provide him with the necessary ingredients. These meals can add permanent improvements to your health and also limit damage taken when guarding. The variety of weapons and upgrades are vast enough, and it certainly stops the action from becoming mundane and repetitive. In fact, one of the reasons I kept replaying through Village was to unlock new guns and upgrade the current ones for the next playthrough. All in all, I would highly recommend this game, especially if you enjoyed Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 7. The atmosphere and locations are great, and the balance of action and suspense is perfect. But just don't go in thinking it's a Resident Evil story with plenty of references. Those days are long gone. It's Resident Evil in name only, although a brilliant one at that.